In September 1066, the English army had not slept properly in 4 days. They had marched 185 miles in less than a week. Feet were bleeding inside worn boots. Horses moved on will more than strength. Men ate whatever they could carry and kept walking because stopping meant England fell. And somewhere ahead, 15,000 Viking warriors were waiting, rested, armed, confident. By every calculation, England should have fallen that afternoon. The Vikings were fresh, positioned, and commanded by the most feared warrior alive in the northern world. The Saxons had nothing left to give. Except they did. What happened at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, was not supposed to be possible. It was not a battle between equals. It was not a fair contest. It was an army running on empty, doing something that rested armies rarely manage. Total destruction. And the story of how 6,000 exhausted men ended the Viking Age in a single afternoon changes everything you think you know about who really won England in 1066. To understand Stamford Bridge, you must first understand what England looked like in the summer of 1066. This was not a country waiting quietly for trouble. This was a country that already knew trouble was arriving from every direction at once. King Edward the Confessor had died in January without a clear heir. That single death cracked England open like a fault line. 3 men immediately believed the throne belonged to them. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl, was crowned within days. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, believed Edward had promised him the crown years earlier. And in Norway, King Harald Hardrada looked at England and saw something else entirely: opportunity. Harald Hardrada was not a man who inspired ordinary fear. He had spent decades fighting across the Byzantine Empire, across Russia, across the entire northern world. He had survived things that killed other men completely. By 1066, he was in his early 50s, enormous in size, and still considered the single most dangerous military commander in Scandinavia. Soldiers who had served under him described the same thing repeatedly. Not cruelty, not rage, something quieter and more unsettling. The absolute certainty that he would find a way to win. His legal claim to England was thin. He argued through a complicated chain of earlier Norse and English agreements that the crown rightfully belonged to Norway. Most historians consider this claim weak. Hardrada did not particularly care. He had 300 ships. He had 15,000 warriors hardened by decades of northern warfare. And he had something no invasion plan can easily buy: an invitation from inside England itself. That invitation came from Tostig, Harold Godwinson's own brother. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria until his own people rose against him for his brutal misrule. Harold, facing impossible choices, had sided with the Northumbrians and exiled his brother. Tostig never forgave it. Humiliated and consumed by the kind of bitterness that only betrayal by family can produce, he traveled north and offered Hardrada local knowledge, political cover, and a reason to frame the invasion not as naked conquest, but as rightful correction. Hardrada accepted. The alliance was sealed, and in September 1066, a fleet of 300 to 500 ships carrying the last great Viking army sailed toward the English coast. Harold Godwinson was in the south, watching the Channel. He had kept his army stationed along the southern coast all summer, burning supplies and patience, waiting for William of Normandy to move. When the Viking fleet appeared in the north instead, Harold faced the kind of decision that separates commanders from administrators. He turned his army around and marched north. Immediately. No debate, no delay. The Vikings moved with the confidence of men who had already decided how this story ended. After landing, Hardrada and Tostig marched on York. Two English earls, Edwin and Morcar, met them at the Battle of Fulford Gate on September 20th. These were not inexperienced men. They had assembled every available fighter and positioned themselves on ground they believed gave them an advantage. A narrow front between a river and a marsh that should have compressed the Viking advance and reduced the impact of numbers. Hardrada had seen positions like this before. He had broken positions like this before. His warriors hit the English line with a disciplined ferocity that Edwin and Morcar had no answer for. The English flanks bent almost immediately under the pressure of men who had been fighting in formation since childhood. When the flanks bent, the center became exposed. When the center became exposed, what had been a defensive stand became a desperate attempt to survive. The English were driven back into the marsh behind them. Men drowned. Men were cut down, trying to run through water that slowed every step. By the time the fighting stopped, the English northern force had effectively ceased to exist as a military unit. York opened its gates without further resistance. Hardrada accepted the city's submission, took hostages from the local nobility, and arranged to collect additional hostages from the surrounding region at a crossing point on the River Derwent, 8 miles east of the city. Stamford Bridge, September 25th. Walking away from York that evening, Harald Hardrada had every reason to believe the campaign was proceeding exactly as planned. He had crossed the sea with the largest Norse force assembled in a generation. He had scattered the only English army that could reach him quickly. He had taken the second city of England without a siege. The remaining resistance would collect itself somewhere to the south. Harold Godwinson would eventually march north, and that final battle would be fought on ground Hardrada chose, at a time Hardrada selected. He had done this before. He knew how it worked. What he did not know was that Harold was already moving. And moving faster than any army had a right to move. The Saxon march north is the part of this story that historians note but audiences rarely feel. 185 miles, 4 days, with an army. To understand what that means physically, consider that a professional marching army in this era covered 20 to 25 miles on a good day over good roads in reasonable weather. Harold's army covered nearly 50 miles a day. Not scouts, not cavalry alone. An army, with the supply elements and support that armies require, moving at a pace that should have broken it before it arrived. Men marched through the night on the final push. Officers who wanted to slow and rest were overruled. Horses that could not maintain pace were left behind. Soldiers who fell out of the column were told to follow when they could and catch up if they were able. On the night of September 23rd, Harold called his commanders together. The argument in that room was not complicated, but it was serious. His housecarls, the professional core of the English force, had been on their feet for days. The men were exhausted. The horses were strained. An army that arrived spent and attacked immediately was an army gambling everything on a single throw. The sensible approach, the approach that every military tradition would have endorsed, was to stop, rest for 2 days, allow stragglers to catch up, feed the horses, let men sleep until they could hold a shield without their arms shaking. Several of Harold's senior commanders made exactly this argument. They were not wrong. The logic was sound. The risk of attacking immediately with a depleted force was real and calculable. Harold listened to every word. Then he made his decision. They would reach Tadcaster by nightfall on the 24th. They would move on Stamford Bridge the following morning. They would attack the same day they arrived. His reasoning was the reasoning of a man who understood that surprise was the only force multiplier available to him. Every hour he waited was an hour for word to reach Hardrada. Every hour Hardrada had was an hour to recall his armor from the ships, to reassemble his scattered force into battle formation, to choose ground instead of being caught on it. The exhaustion his army carried was a cost. Harold had calculated it and accepted it because the alternative was a rested army fighting a prepared enemy. And he did not believe a rested army was worth what preparation would cost him. Some of his commanders disagreed until the day they died. Some of them died 3 weeks later at Hastings, still wondering if he had been right. The morning of September 25th broke warm and clear over Stamford Bridge. On the eastern bank of the River Derwent, Viking warriors lounged in the September sun. Across the wooden bridge, more men rested on the western side. Conversations moved between groups. Food was being prepared. Weapons were stacked rather than held. There was no urgency, no elevated alert, no reason for either. From Harald Hardrada's position that morning, everything looked exactly as it should. Then a rider on the western bank looked toward the road from York. Dust first, then movement, then the shape of something too wide and too dense to be anything other than an army. The morning light catching metal across a front that stretched beyond easy measurement. The alarm spread in seconds. Men who had been sitting stood. Men who had been eating dropped food and reached for weapons. Officers began shouting, their voices layered over each other before any single order could be understood. The mood of a warm, administrative morning became something entirely different before anyone had finished processing what their eyes were telling them. Hardrada's force was divided by the river, partially unarmed, spread across open ground with no defensive preparation, no forward positions, no arrangement that was anything other than a column at rest. He had minutes, not hours. He sent riders racing back to the ships immediately, ordering the reserve force and the stored armor to move at maximum speed. He knew they would take hours to arrive. He had to hold the bridge until they did. What happened next is the moment this battle has been remembered for across nearly 1,000 years, even by people who know nothing else about September 25th, 1066. A single Viking warrior walked to the center of the bridge and stopped. His name was never recorded. No chronicle that survived thought to write it down. He was simply a man with an axe who looked at what was coming across the western bank and made a decision that required no discussion and no orders. His position was the bridge. His job was to hold it. The Saxons sent men forward. The bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men walking side by side. The Viking stood in the center and used that narrowness as his armor. Every attacker had to come at him through a space that prevented them from using their numbers. His axe was long and the bridge was short, and the men who stepped onto the planking toward him discovered both of those facts at the same moment. One Saxon fell, then another, then more. The army on the far bank watched a single man hold them at a river crossing and could not immediately solve the problem. Archers fired. He absorbed hits and kept his feet. Groups rushed the bridge and were driven back. He was bleeding. He was still standing. And every minute he stood was a minute the reserve force got closer to the field. The men watching from the Saxon bank would remember this for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives proved to be. The sight of it. One man and an axe and a narrow bridge and an army that could not pass. There is no word in any language that fully captures what it feels like to watch that. It was not admirable from their side. It was not something they could afford to respect in that moment. It was an obstacle that was costing them the surprise they had marched 4 days to deliver. He was finally killed, not from the front, but from below. A Saxon soldier found a small boat and floated under the bridge. Through the gaps between the planking, a spear was driven upward. The bridge fell. The Saxon army crossed. That unnamed man had held them long enough to matter, and not long enough to change the battle. He had done exactly what one man standing alone can do. He had bought minutes, carved his deed into the memory of everyone present, and guaranteed that his name would be forgotten, while his action never was. The Viking force on the eastern bank scrambled into the formation they had trained for since boyhood. The shield wall. Overlapping shields, bodies braced against bodies, weapons angled outward at the angles that had broken armies from Ireland to Constantinople. Norse warriors had built their entire military identity on this formation. It was instinctive. It was disciplined. It had worked for generations against enemies far larger than the force now crossing the bridge toward them. On this morning, it was formed by men without armor, without full weapons, without the reserve force, in a position they had not chosen, against an enemy arriving at a run. Harold's housecarls hit them before the wall was fully set. The housecarls were England's professional warriors, men who trained for this every day of their adult lives, equipped with the finest weapons English coin could produce. They carried the long Danish axe, a weapon that could split a shield and the arm holding it in a single swing. They wore mail. They had slept a few hours in Tadcaster the night before, which was more rest than they had managed in 4 days. And they carried something the Vikings facing them could not access in that moment. Momentum. And 4 days of anger looking for somewhere to go. The Saxon charge struck the Viking line with the force of men who had been walking toward this moment since York and needed it to be finished. The impact on the unarmored front ranks was immediate and devastating. Blows that chainmail would have deflected became wounds. Men who had expected to spend the morning collecting the formal submission of a conquered region were dying on English grass in the September sun, killed by an army that should not have been there yet. Harald Hardrada did not retreat. This was the defining characteristic of the man across 30 years of warfare. He rode into the thickest part of the fighting personally, driving his warriors forward through sheer force of presence, through the kind of will that makes men around it believe that things can still be turned. For a time, it worked. The shield wall bent but did not collapse. Saxons pushed and Vikings pushed back, and the battle became the grinding, close-range violence that neither side could escape and both sides understood. Then the arrow found him. It struck Harald Hardrada in the throat. The accounts agree on this detail, even when they disagree on everything else. The man who had fought under Byzantine banners, who had broken Norse kings, who had made the northern world afraid for 3 decades, died on a piece of English ground he had chosen for its convenience, 8 miles from a city he had already taken. The line shuddered. Not collapse, not yet, but a shudder that every man on both sides could feel, even through the noise and the press and the smoke. Their king was down. Their armor was at the ships. Their reserve had not arrived. Tostig took command. Harold sent a messenger offering terms. There was still a chance to end it. Take what remained of the force, board the ships, leave England behind. The offer was real. Harold did not make it from weakness. He made it because he understood what waited for him in the south. And he did not need to spend more of his army than the battle required. Tostig refused. Whatever had driven him to bring a foreign army to the country of his birth was still driving him now. The fighting resumed. The reserve force arrived in the late afternoon. They came at a run, men still tightening armor that had been thrown on during the sprint from the ships, still forming into something resembling ranks, driven forward by the sounds of battle they had heard carrying across the flat ground for hours. They were fresher than anyone on the field. They were properly equipped, and they hit the Saxon flanks with the compressed fury of men who had listened to a battle they were not in for hours, and finally had somewhere to put it. For a long moment, the field tilted. Fresh Viking warriors drove into Saxon flanks with enough force to create genuine danger. Harold's men had been fighting since morning. The exhaustion that had been sitting behind their eyes since the march was now sitting in their arms and legs in a way that rest cannot fix and will alone cannot fully overcome. The shield wall that had been advancing stopped. In sections, it bent backward under the pressure of men arriving with full strength against men who had already spent most of theirs. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire battle. Harold did not panic. He did not commit his remaining reserves in a single desperate throw. He watched the line, the way a man who knows his army watches it, looking for the difference between a bend that will recover and a break that will not. He fed reinforcement to the sections under the most pressure. He kept the formation. He kept the line. And he understood something about the men attacking him that they could not yet understand about themselves. They had run miles to reach this fight. Their fury was genuine. But fury burns fast, and what replaces it in the body is exhaustion. And these men had spent their reserve of strength getting to the field. They were already paying the same price Harold's army had been paying since York. They had just started paying it later. The Saxon line held. As the light changed through the afternoon, the fresh Viking force spent itself against a wall that refused to give ground. The reinforcements who had arrived with such violent momentum began to slow. Harold's warriors, men who had been told 4 days ago that what they were attempting was impossible, found what exhausted men sometimes find when stopping means dying. Not strength, something that functions like it when nothing else remains. Tostig was killed. The Viking command structure was gone. The reserve had spent everything it had brought to the field. What followed was not an organized retreat, it was dissolution. Viking warriors left the field in fragments. First, small groups peeling from the edges, then larger sections losing cohesion, then the remainder running for the ships with Saxons behind them and broken ground under their feet. The pursuit was without mercy. Of the 300 to 500 ships that had carried the Viking invasion to England, fewer than 25 made the return voyage to Norway. Read that again. fewer than 25. An entire generation of Norse fighting strength, the men who had defined what military power meant in the northern world for 30 years, had come to England and been destroyed between sunrise and sunset on a warm September afternoon. The men who sailed home carried something heavier than grief. They carried the knowledge that there was no coming back from this, that what had been attempted here would not be attempted again, not in this generation, not in the next. The Viking Age of conquest in England did not fade over time. It did not retreat slowly under diplomatic pressure or gradual English military recovery. It ended on a wooden bridge on a morning nobody had planned to fight, completed by an afternoon none of the survivors would ever fully describe to anyone who had not been there. Harald Hardrada was buried in England. Tostig alongside him, the two men whose alliance had brought this force across the sea, now sharing ground in the country they had tried to take. Harold Godwinson stood on a field that was quiet for the first time in a week. He had done something that looked impossible from the night of September 24th. He had marched 185 miles, made the decision to attack without rest when every reasonable voice said, "Wait," launched an assault the morning he arrived, and destroyed the most feared military commander in the northern world, along with the army behind him. The victory was total. The cost was real, and it was serious. The housecarls, who formed the backbone of English military power, had taken losses they could not quickly replace. Men who had kept walking when their bodies had every reason to stop were in the ground now alongside the men they had killed. The army that had won was not the army that had left the south. It was smaller, thinner, more damaged than Harold could easily admit to himself standing on that field. 3 days later, word arrived from the south. William of Normandy had crossed the Channel. He had landed at Pevensey with an army that had been resting and preparing while Harold's force had been marching and fighting and marching again. He was moving inland, burning the countryside of Harold's own earldom, daring the English king to come south immediately and fight before he was ready. Harold turned his army around and marched south. The men who had just destroyed the last great Viking army were asked to do it again against a different enemy on a different front after no meaningful rest. Some of Harold's commanders argued again for waiting, for letting the army recover, for gathering the full strength of England before meeting William on the field. The argument was the same argument they had made before Stamford Bridge. Harold made the same choice. Whether that choice was brilliant or fatal is a question historians have argued for nearly 1,000 years, and this is not the place to resolve it. What happened at Hastings 3 weeks later belongs to a different story. This is the story of Stamford Bridge. And Stamford Bridge deserves to be remembered on its own terms, not as the prelude to Hastings, not as the footnote that explains why Harold's army was tired when it mattered most, not as the thing that happened right before the thing that changed England, as the afternoon when an exhausted army refused to stop moving and ended an age. Every leader who has ever been told to wait, to rest, to be cautious before acting has faced the same calculation Harold faced on the night of September 24th in Tadcaster. The ground ahead was unknown. The army behind him was spent. The rational choice was to pause. Every reasonable voice in the room was making that case. The logic was sound. He chose to keep moving instead. Power does not always belong to the largest force. It does not always belong to the rested army, or the fresh warriors, or the men with the most ships in the harbor. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who are already there. And sometimes the most dangerous soldiers in the world are not the ones who are ready. They are the ones who refuse to stop.